Hi, it's Alistair McIntyre, Electric Scotland. This video is to do with slavery. I'm just wondering if I explain the background and what I'm interested in, if any of you can come up with any books on the topic. I'd like to study them. I'm finding it very difficult to find anything. Essentially, this is to do with slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries specifically. But what I've been doing, I have over many years been doing a lot of research on the social life in Scotland, both Highlands, Lowlands, everywhere in Scotland. And what I've found is that in the old days, frankly, we didn't live in particularly good conditions. If you think about it, clan chiefs had a lot of authority in the old days. So you get a situation whereby that they appoint tacksmen to look after parts of their estate. And the tacksmen then, they will apply rents or conditions for the ordinary clanspeople to live and work on their small holdings, crofts, whatever. And if you read all about that kind of history, one, you'll find out that the accommodation, shall we say, that a lot of the people had in those days was very basic. A lot of them were just like two-room button bends, where animals were in the second room and the people lived in the first room. And quite often there was a circular fire in the middle of the room, and sleeping was done on the edges, along the walls, and people kind of sat maybe on very low stools because it was often a peat fire in the Highlands especially, so there was a lot of smoke around the place. So if you sat in a low stool, you were usually underneath the smoke. And of course you hear the tales in the islands, for example, of the bards coming over, the storytellers, and how when they arrived at a village they were often encouraged to stay for several days and would stay in a particular hut. And then the people would gather around to listen to the storytelling. But at the end of the day, I remember reading a story about the Isle of Skye in the old days, and again they came to this pretty ruinous, almost a kind of cabin in a way, but the author was saying it was amazing how many lobster shells, oyster shells, crab shells that were around the property. So clearly they ate very well, but their living conditions were very poor. And of course, you get to the time of like the clearances, where a lot of people were turfed off their land by the clan chiefs so that they could put sheep on it, because they thought they'd make more money by putting sheep on these lands. I also have a book on the site about crofting, which was done by an ardent proponent of crofting, but he stated that unfortunately most of the clan chiefs were not terribly intelligent people, and they didn't really understand how they could have encouraged their tenantry to look after the properties better. And he goes in this whole book, explains exactly how you could do very well on a very small croft. And I might also add to that I also put up a book about an American family, and the book was written about 5 acres enough, meaning you could actually make a very good living for your family by just having 5 acres of ground, but looking after it intensively. And this is where this crofting guy was talking about, that even a small croft could not only feed you, but could give you a bit of cash over the top to actually pay your rent, but also to buy actual product. And so I was looking at the possibilities of where the mass of people were, especially in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. But I'd say I noticed that the living conditions were poor, that the taxman could be really nasty, not only putting up your rent, but also to demand labour from you. Because a lot of them couldn't afford the rent, so they would maybe have to give up to 6 months of their labour to the taxman to be able to afford to stay where they were. And of course a lot of the clansmen went to the coast to do fishing during the winter because they couldn't make ends meet on their small croft. So the living conditions for many were very poor. Now of course if all the people around you are in the same kind of condition, it didn't make it obvious that you were living in very poor conditions. Now, the reason I come to the slavery issue is that I can't remember the name of the series, Kunta Kinte kind of comes to mind. It was this American African who decided he wanted to trace his roots. So it was a big series on television a lot of years ago now, but he was talking about where he originally came from and how he traced his slave-bearing ancestors through. And eventually he managed to find out what country he came from, and he visited the place and found the original village. And in that village there was a medicine man or a certain elder, but he kept the history of the whole tribe, you might say. So as he started to recite all the names going way back, suddenly his great-great-great-grandfather's name was mentioned in that list. And that was proof positive that was where he had originated, or his family had originated from. But I remember that book and looking at the way the slaves were treated, and let me say right away, I don't agree in slavery at all. So I'm pleased there's no slavery as such these days, although there still is slavery around. But certainly I'm against slavery. But I also noticed a lot of the Scots were that were caught in after the Battle of Culloden were put in prison, then sent to America as indentured servants. So that was a form of slavery as well. So a lot of Scots were tied up in that, but in a way, on these little crofts that they once had, they were almost slaves as well. And so I was interested to know what happened, say, after the clearances when we went to America. And I presume some of the Scots became slave owners. And I thus wondered in my mind how actually bad some of that slavery was. Because it kind of got into my mind that not all slave owners surely were sadistic, horrible people. And certainly when I watched that film about Kunta Kinte, I could see the conditions they were living in, which actually I thought were better living conditions than the Scots had at the same time living in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And looking at the food they ate, they seemed to actually be better fed than a lot of the islanders and the Highlanders were eating back home in Scotland. Now, and if you look at freedom of choice, I mean, to live where you were living, you had to maybe give 6 months of your life to working for the clan chief or the taxman he appointed. And I don't necessarily know that that was freedom. So, but there was this clan association where in theory you could talk to the chief, and the chief would listen to you. But I can't see that that is not the same with slavery, because surely some of the slaves were able to talk to their masters. And since it seemed to me that some of them at least were well treated and respected. But I've used Google to search, but now I must confess I've been very critical of Google of late, simply because if you're a researcher, it's damn difficult to find stuff on Google. Because they don't care about research. They only care about popularity and numbers of searching. And so many people today are interested in just getting a little scrap of information, Whereas I want books worth of information so I can really appreciate what was going on. And I haven't actually found a book by a slave owner explaining how he ran his estate with slaves. And that's where I'd ask for your help. If you know of a book, or there's an antiquarian book that's on an archive somewhere, maybe send me the link so I can download it and read it. But I have this notion in my mind that if it was and I don't know how many Scots actually ran slave estates. I've no idea any number. I mean, I know some Scots must have been slave owners, but how many, I don't know. But I'm kind of wondering if the Scots were there and had an estate run by slaves, whether he treated them a bit like a clan, in that these are his people and therefore his assets. Because remember, in the old days with the clan chiefs, the power was based solely on the number of men they could bring to battle to back up their views, or if they decided to go in with another group of people. You know, I mean, their authority came from the number of people they could raise that would fight on their behalf for what their goals were. So the chief's power came from the numbers of the people and the people that would obey him when it came to these kind of wars that went on. And I therefore wonder whether some slave owners had the same view, that the slaves were an asset to be well managed, because cotton picking is a very tough job. So they obviously had to be fed reasonably well and looked after, otherwise they couldn't do the work. And some of them, I would think, obviously made sure they had decent clothing, decent homes and stuff like that. I mean, we hear things going on like in Rhodesia, which is now Zambia. Oh, it's not, is it Zambia? But the old Rhodesia, where Mugabe came to power, basically it was the breadbasket of Africa there. They were very rich and wealthy because the white owning population there ran big farming estates. And basically, yes, the black workers worked for them, but from what I could see, they were treated well, they were paid well, they ate well. But when Mugabe came to power, he closed most of the estates and gave plots of land to individual black families. The trouble was, they didn't have enough, they didn't know enough to actually grow crops on that land that would make them money. And that's why it's one of the poorest countries in the entire world now. And about, I think, 90% of the food needs to be imported, whereas they used to export food in the old days. In other words, this idea of giving you freedom, a little plot of land, doesn't actually work. And that's why I'm wondering about the slave owners, whether they... I mean, you hear the stories where, like, the wife of a slave was sold to another slave owner, or the daughter or son was sold to another slave, like breaking up the family. I mean, things like that are not nice at all. And of course, and you know, we acknowledge that certainly some of the slaves were very badly treated, but I kind of wonder overall whether there were some benefits in the slave owning community, and whether the Scots in particular treated them a bit like a clan, because after all they were under the clan chief, and in return for living and being, should we say, supported by the clan chief, they had to give a lot of free labour to him. And so, to me, you see, that's a form of slavery. But they had a community there, which they seemed to accept. And therefore I wonder in the slave-owning estates whether these were communities in their own right, and some communities obviously did better than others. But as I say, my suspicion is that a lot of slave owners actually did well by their slaves, and the slaves actually had better conditions, living conditions, food, clothes, than a lot of the Scots did back home in Scotland in the same period. That's my feeling. But I don't know, because as I say, it's very difficult now to find anything where a slave owner might have written, or someone might have written about an estate that was run by slaves. And that's why I'm trying to find something that might either prove or disprove. I mean, I say I accept there's a lot of bad things about slavery, and I'm against slavery, but back in those days, I'm just wondering about the attitude of the slave owners. So, I think that's my main point, is that I could see a Scot coming from a clan system in Scotland, especially the Highlands and Islands, where frankly they were badly looked after, but also when the clearances came along, because of the bad way that the clans chiefs decided to get rid of their people to put sheep on the land, which is very ignorant of them. You know, I mean, a lot of them were going around the shores using driftwood to make a little kind of hut or something to live in, and trying to scavenge for crabs or limpets and winkles and stuff like that off the seashore. I mean, that was diabolical. And so if you've come from that type of background, you're now in America, you've now got your own estate, you've got your own set of slaves to help you manage the land. I'm wondering if they in turn treated their people better than they were treated themselves. Which is not to say it's perfect by any manner of means, but I would like to try to understand more of that. So there's just my thoughts, is that a lot of slaves, I believe, in America were better treated than a lot of Scots were as free people in Scotland. That's my kind of point, is that did the Scots that went there do a better job of looking after the people than they had been looked after themselves? So if you've got anything you can give me on that, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.